righty. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate you taking the time and are excited to share some additional details with you on some specific scoring categories. And in particular, today, of course, we'll be focusing on usability and cost. So my name is Carly Champagne. I'm a postdoctoral researcher on the EC Prism team at the University of Oregon, and I primarily work on the data side of this project, including the development of our scoring system. I want to note, if you do have questions that come up throughout the presentation, please put them right into the chat as you have them. My colleague, Camille Sullivan, go ahead and give a wave, Camille. Who's also an integral part of our data team, will be monitoring the chat for us and curating some of those questions at the end. I also want to note that 15 minutes is very short to cover this content as well as your questions. So we will be sharing contact information. And so please feel free, if we don't get to your questions, to reach out to us and follow up. Okay. The first thing I'm going to mention is just to kind of situate us with the larger context of the project and scoring categories. So all measures on our website are scored based on these 4 overall categories, all of which have their own subcomponents and lots of individual details. So again, we'll be focusing on those first 2, usability and cost today. And I also want to note that everything we talk about today in these scoring breakout sessions are included on the scoring page of our website, as well as the scoring guidebook, which you can download from that page, which has all the detail you could want and then some. So please feel free to use those resources as well if there are things that we don't get to. Okay, so I'm going to go over all of the subcategories that are included in the usability category. So each of the components that I discuss contribute to that overall usability score and are the things that we're thinking about and kind of evaluating when we score each measure. So a main component of usability, of course, is how long does the measure take to complete and to administer. And so that includes not just the actual number of minutes it takes, but also what materials are required in order to administer. So some measures have materials that require getting set up or taking down. And then we also consider the time it takes to calculate the scores, if applicable. So some measures provide the scores for you, but many don't. And so that's added time to consider when administering the measure. Another component of usability that we consider we call training ease. And this essentially refers to how difficult is it to learn how to administer the measure. And here, high difficulty will get a lower usability score. For time, of course, the longer it takes, the lower the usability score. Some of the elements that contribute to training ease include things like whether coding is required, whether or not there are standardized instructions that you need to learn to say during the administration of the measure, as well as, again, any of those materials that are needed to learn. Some measures you have to interact with materials with a child, for example, in a very specific ways that you have to be trained on. Another aspect of usability is how interpretable are the results of the measure. So some things that contribute there that we consider is whether the measure is standardized, as well as if the measure developer provides any supplemental materials to facilitate that interpretation process. So sometimes measure developers will provide information on how to interpret percentiles, for example, or scaffold some of the data scoring process, things like that. And then finally, an additional category that applies in particular to electronic measures, so tablet or website-based measures, we consider whether or not internet is required in order to administer. So of course, depending on where you're implementing a measure, that's going to contribute to how usable it is for you, whether or not you're able to have an internet connection. So this is really the full snapshot of what currently contributes to that overall usability score. And now I'm just going to walk through a quick example that uses the compare function on our website. So this is exactly what you would see if you use that compare function and selected these two measures on our website. And so to kind of illustrate some of those categories that I just talked about, the ASQ SE2, which you see on the right, is a social emotional based measure. They're both within that social emotional development overall domain, but are very different in terms of the types of measures they have and how usable they are. So the ASQ SE is a survey-based measure. It's quite short. There's no training required, and therefore it has a quite high usability score. In contrast, the ESI measure is an observation-based measure within that same domain. And so this one requires observing a play period of the child with a set of toys and an adult, and looks at the behavior and interactions that happen during that play period. And so there's a lot more required in terms of training ease for the ESI compared to the ASQ because of those materials that are involved, as well as the training that's necessary to understand what behaviors to look for and how to code those in terms of how they contribute to the measure result. And so kind of in summary, the ESI takes longer, it's much more difficult to learn how to administer, and therefore has a lower score compared to the ASQ SE2, which is shorter and doesn't involve as much of that training. I do want to note, and this is kind of a broader comment on our scoring in general that I think is really important to emphasize, which is if a measure has a low usability score, that does not mean that we don't recommend using the measure. So we recognize that folks have lots of different needs and priorities in terms of their organizational context and their measurement goals. And so you can think of these scores really just as a snapshot assessment, but there may be folks that are really most interested in a more detailed, comprehensive look at social emotional development and would like to get that from the ESI. Whereas other folks may really have time as the main priority and are not able to invest a lot of time in that measure administration and training. So it's really about what your needs and priorities are. And as Katie mentioned earlier in the event, you are able to set those preferences on the website so that your results are filtered based on those priorities. Okay, so transitioning to the other category of interest today, which is cost. So a little bit simpler here, only two subcategories. So one of those is the actual how much does the measure cost? Is it at cost? Is it free? And then the other component is the level of access. So the extent to which you can actually get your hands on the measure itself. So another example here using our compare function. So if you look on the left, the CREDI has a 10 out of 10 score. And in this particular category, a high score refers to low cost or free. And so the CREDI here has a high score because it is free and highly accessible. So this is a measure that you can download immediately and use right away. So it's free and accessible. On the right, we have a different example, the PEDS, and this measure is at cost, so it requires purchase in order to use, which brings down that score for it. So I'll give a couple examples of accessibility and how it relates to the website specifically, but just to give you a sense of how we think about this category, these are kind of the different levels. So of course you have free versus at cost, but it's not always the case that if a measure is free, it's readily accessible. So some measures like the CREDI, as I mentioned, you can go right to the website and download the measure itself and use. But some measures that are not at cost are still not quite accessible in that same way. So sometimes you may need to create an account with the developer or the publisher. Sometimes you may need to fill out a contact form, or the measure may only be available within a research article and you may need to reach out to the developer directly. And then of course, if a measure is at cost, it's considered inaccessible. Okay, so lastly, I'll just give you a sense of how that accessibility relates to the website specifically. So on the measure detail page, you'll see this access measure button. And essentially, depending on that level of accessibility that I just mentioned, that will direct where that takes you when you click on it. So for the Credi, because it's free, it will bring you to the page where you can download lots of different materials. For other measures that are free and accessible, it may bring you directly to a PDF. That just depends on what the developer offers. And if there's more than one specific file that they offer, we'll bring you so that you can choose between those. And then again, for that PEDS example, so because this measure is at cost and inaccessible, when you click that access measure button, it will bring you right to the page where you have all your purchase options listed out. So that is kind of how you're able to access that measure to the extent. Okay, and I saw that reminder that we have about probably a little less than 5 minutes left, which is perfect. And again, I just want to emphasize all the information covered in this session is included on the scoring page of our website, and even more detail is in that scoring guidebook. And we have our contact information here as well as social media. Always feel free to reach out and either ask questions or provide feedback. But for our remaining time, we'll open it up for questions and I will ask Camille to pose those for us.
Yeah, thank you. So please feel free to add any questions that might have come up during this or during the larger presentation into the chat. But I'm just going to steal a question from the larger group, which was a participant who was wanting more information about the ease part of usability. They were interested in how that relates to sharing the results of a measure with caregivers and how clear it is to caregivers what kind of actions they should take next.
Can you say that first part again? You cut out a little bit.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, they were wanting more information on the ease part of usability.
The training ease. Mm-hmm. And in terms of caregivers specifically?
Yeah, in terms of, I think, caregivers receiving the results of a measure and knowing what to do next, kind of what next action steps they could take, and if those related.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the user perspective or kind of respondent perspective is something we continue to think about. I know we're going to get bumped out here in a few seconds, but I'll just mention that the training ease information will be available right on the website for folks to view. And in terms of getting those results, there's quite a bit of variability. Some measures will spit the results out automatically that caregivers can immediately view and interpret. Whereas other times a researcher or a clinician may need to do that scoring process and then communicate those results to a caregiver or the respondent of the measure. So differences there in terms of how the scores are shared. Thank you all so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of our event.